two-state solution makes sense at this point. I know the Israeli government is still committed to it. The United States is committed to it, but ultimately, isn't the two-state solution based on the assumption that somehow the Arabs are going to change and they're going to give up their idea of destroying Israel and decide to live in peace like friends? Is that a realistic
I'm still very divided on my opinions about the two-state solution. On one hand, I would desperately want it. I would want to live side by side with the Palestinians in their state. I think the Palestinians deserve a state, and I think we could have very fruitful relations. On the other hand, I'm very, very skeptical about the likelihood of such a two-state solution emerging, not because the Israelis don't want it, but because the Palestinians seem incapable of sustaining it. Palestinians hold the world record of a people who have been most frequently offered a state, only to turn it down, and to turn it down with violence. They were offered a state by the British in 1938. They were offered by the UN in 1947. They were offered by Jimmy Carter in 1979. They were offered by Bill Clinton in 2000. They keep on turning it down. They turn to violence. We keep trying to impose a state structure on them. We created the Palestinian Authority. We created the presidency and the prime minister, the premiership there. They didn't create it. We created it. We keep on trying to impose it on them, and it cannot sustain itself as a state. And this is a broader problem in the Arab world. The Palestinians are symptomatic for it. So Condoleezza Rice, who's in the region today, can keep on trying to build up Mahmoud Abbas as a Palestinian leader, but ultimately he and the society around him is not going to be able to sustain that state structure. So we have to begin to look at alternative solutions, at least for the interim.
Now, what about the idea of Jordan as a Palestinian state? The geographic region historically known as Palestine includes Jordan. Jordan is literally part of Palestine. It includes both sides of the Jordan River. It's mostly what we would call Palestinian anyway. So what about, I mean, the land of Palestine has already been subdivided, and the Arabs have already been given a state called Jordan. Why must Israel be subdivided again and have another Arab state there?
Well, one reason to subdivide the Jewish state is if we don't subdivide the Jewish state, we will not have a Jewish state because we won't have the Jewish majority upon which the Jewish state is predicated. But having said that, I believe that Jordan has a role in reaching some of these interim solutions, perhaps a condominium with Jordan over the governance of parts of the West Bank. So you have Palestinian autonomy with some elements of Jordanian control, plus Israeli security measures that are in place. That is the most I can see right now.
I understand that Jordan is adamantly opposed to letting Palestinians from Israel move there. They don't want them. They won't accept them in. They rigidly keep them out.
Jordan is a minority rule state. It's ruled by a minority of Jordanians, East Bank Jordanians, who have their roots in Bedouin culture. The majority are Palestinians. They're very much afraid of the Palestinians. Palestinians aren't particularly enamored of the Hashemites. And no, they do not want further Palestinians in their kingdom. However, they're also much afraid of the emergence of a Hamas chaos state on their western border that would bleed into Jordan. So they're also interested. We have a confluence of interests with the Jordanians in achieving a situation of controlling this Hobbesian state of chaos in the West Bank.
Do you think that Israel is too concerned about international opinion, too quick to follow the lead of Western countries, the U.S., the Europeans, as opposed to making its own decision and leading? Israel is the one that's most directly affected. Shouldn't it be leading rather than following others who don't necessarily have Israel's interest as their primary concern?
I think Israeli leaders could display greater savvy, greater prudence in adjusting their decisions to accord with international opinions. For example, there are some times when Israeli leaders will do things in defiance of international relations, rather gratuitously, and achieve no apparent benefit from it. On the other hand, sometimes Israelis will bend over backwards to palliate international opinion, and again, achieving no sort of concrete benefit from it. I can give you examples. Last summer, the Israeli Air Force bombed a lot of civilian areas in Lebanon. They did so in an attempt to take out missiles, but they did so in a way that completely ignored the impact of their bombing on world opinion. And ultimately, it was the bombing and its impact on world opinion which forced Israel to stop the war. They completely ignored that factor.
Now, how does Israel weigh the importance of international opinion versus the well-being of its own citizens? Right now, the town of Sderot near the Gaza Strip is subject to daily missile attacks, and the Israeli government is not responding to the attacks because it says that the Europeans are pleased by this. In other words, they're literally sacrificing the lives of their own people to please powers foreign to themselves. Is there something wrong with that picture?
Well, I'm not happy with Israel's response to the shelling of Sderot, but not necessarily because they're not sending vast forces into Gaza and crushing the Gazans, because that's not going to bring about an end to the shelling. I'm disturbed because Israel is not taking the battle to the people who are giving the order to the people who are firing the rocket. I do not understand why Khaled Mashal, the head of Hamas who sits in Damascus, can sit in Damascus and give orders to the Qassam rocket fires with impunity and is not paying a personal price for it. That I don't understand.
Well, it's hard to get somebody in Damascus because that's another country, but somebody in the Gaza Strip?
Some of the Gaza Strip, we're not doing that either, though. Ismail Haniyeh, who's the head of Hamas, which is the organization which has kidnapped our soldier, Gilad Shalit, which is firing rockets into Sderot, holds press conferences. I don't understand why that happened.
And it seems that Israel, its deterrent ability has all but collapsed because of its non-responsiveness. Every day we hear about shooting attacks in Israel, rock-throwing attacks, and Israelis are not actually allowed to respond properly, so there's no cost. On the Arab side, very little cost. So why not do it?
I would say our deterrence force has collapsed entirely. Keep in mind, Israel in last summer's war in Lebanon used a tiny fraction of its military force. We had about 10,000 men inside Lebanon, several hundred tanks. Israel has many thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of planes and helicopters. We used a tiny fraction of this force. With that tiny fraction of the force, we completely destroyed Hezbollah's main state in southern Lebanon. We destroyed their headquarters in Beirut. We probably killed about 25% of their soldiers, which is just a prohibitive number in any type of military engagement.
But they're bound to
back. They'll bounce it back, but believe me, Hassan Nasrallah will think twice before he fires at Israel again. We sent an ineluctable message to the states in the region, that is, that if you mess with us, yes, you may be able to send some rockets into our hometowns, but we are going to ruin your day. And we definitely ruined their day. So the South Lebanon remains very much in ruins. So I think he'd think twice about it. Hassan Nasrallah himself admitted that he had made a mistake by starting the war. So our deterrence power has been dented, but it is no means eliminated. I think our neighbors, certainly the more savvy among them, understand that the Israeli military juggernaut has not really been unleashed, not fully, not even in 1973, and they're going to be loath to test that.
In the 1967 war, Israel won a very impressive victory, defeated many Arab countries, and at that time people were saying that Israel's existence was guaranteed because it could not only defeat any individual Arab country, it could defeat any combination of Arab countries. You don't hear that kind of talk anymore. And back then, the Palestinians were considered a marginal threat at the most. So what's the reason for Israel's decline? Why did it lose the fruits of that victory in 1967?
Well, in 1967, it wasn't all of the, not all of the Israelis all the time believed that Israel could beat any combination of the Arabs. If that were the case, Israel would not have gone into a total panic in 1967. Many Israelis believed, and not without good reason, that Israel was facing an existential threat, and were unconvinced that Israel would survive the end of June 1967. I think that today, Israel, if it takes a step back, will find that it is vastly militarily superior to what it was in 1967. Keep in mind that we do not face the Soviet bloc today. There are no major superpowers backing these Arabs. There is no major threat of Egyptian tanks rolling down the streets of Tel Aviv. We face a different type of threat. We face a threat to our economy, to our civil society, of prolonged rocket fire into civil areas. This is a different type of threat than the one we faced in 1967. We face a strategic threat from the Iranians. And while maintaining robust conventional forces, tank brigades, paratrooper battalions are very, very important for Israel, the response today is as much lies in the realm of high-tech, of innovation, as it does sort of slogging through the mud with guns. And I think that Israel remains really, to a degree that is unsurpassed in its history, the preeminent superpower of the Middle East.
And that was part 2 of my interview with Michael Oren. I think one of the most significant things he discussed is the issue of world opinion, whether Israel places too much concern about what the world thinks. Yeah, its relations with the rest of the world are important, but protecting its own citizens are important. That is generally considered to be the first and foremost responsibility of any government.
Right, you're quite right. It's a difficult balancing act because of the degree to which Israel is dependent upon its relationships with foreign countries, especially Europe, United Kingdom, and the USA, not only for such things as raw materials and oil, gasoline, but also the things that it cannot produce itself very well, and in sort of the reverse direction, having those markets open to it, because Israel has a very small amount of population and its own market is very tiny. So it's a very difficult thing. We saw in the 1973 war that when the United States held off on the resupplying, which President Nixon had promised, it put Israel in a very compromised position on the battlefield at the very moment that it needed all the resupplies. So it has to strike a balance, and it's not always easy to do that.
But Israel has a very robust economy. It doesn't have many resources, but it has a lot of intellectual properties. It has a lot of high-tech properties. It sells all over the world.
Yes.
I'm wondering if maybe their sense of dependency is not more of a psychological thing, maybe through long centuries of living in exile. They can't quite accept the idea that they have their own country and it's time to stand up on their own feet.
I wouldn't put it in that extreme a term, but I think you're on the right track. There is certainly a psychology, at least in part of Israeli leadership, which is, oh my God, we can't go it alone. And the thing is, they can't go it alone. But it's certainly possible that they could be more forceful in certain areas and just say, any nation in the world, if faced with a year and a half of endless bombardment from its neighbor, would go in there and destroy the neighbor. So we are going to. But they don't say that.
I think in any case, all nations act according to their own interests. The U.S. might think it's in its interest for Israel to refrain from doing something.
Yes.
But if Israel does it anyway and succeeds,
well,
the U.S. might be pleased with that.
You hit the nail on the head. If Israel does it anyway and succeeds, and then American interests are also satisfied by that success, then we're home free. But what if it doesn't succeed? Then Israel has to weigh the question.
Well, that's where it has to have the confidence in itself. That's where, the sense of self comes in. And,
yes. Well, the sense of self, but also balanced with the realism of what the real problems it faces are. And that's why it's a balancing act. And I think that you're right in part, and you're on the right track. But it's not an easy decision when the greatest superpower, the only superpower in the world, says, no, don't do that yet. Well, wait a minute. What will happen if you do and it doesn't work? Then you could be in big trouble.
I wonder who's leading this relationship. It's a little hard to tell sometimes. Do the ideas originate in Washington and Israel follows? Or does Israel make a suggestion and hope that Washington goes along? Is Washington saying, you guys live there, you guys understand this region better than we do. We really wish you would just take charge and make it all work.
No.
And then let us take credit for it.
No, Washington does not say that. But I can tell you that certain decisions are made in Washington and superimposed on Israel. Israel, do not sell those weapons to China. We have our own version we want to sell to China. That was superimposed on Israel. Other decisions are made in Israel. They're brought to presidents, and they're given to the president and said, look, back this. The president backs it, and then the prime minister goes back to Israel and said, hey, the president said we have to do this, so I guess we better do it. So, for example, in the recent, back in August of 2005, the removal of 9,000 Israelis from Gaza, right, this plan, that was a plan that we brought to America, got Bush's support for, and then came back and said, hey, we got to do this. So it works in different directions.
The U.S. government was not particularly favorable to that plan. It didn't really understand why Israel was doing it, but it went along because Israel
thought it would work.
To do it.
Right.
It's now time to go on to the next segment, which is your interview with Michael Oren.
Right. Well, we're going to hear Professor Oren's opinion on, first off, Lebanon and what's happening with Hezbollah and the perceived coup d'etat. Then we'll talk some about the assertion that the road to Baghdad runs through Jerusalem. In other words, solve the Israel-Arab conflict problem, and then everything else will get sort of handled by itself. And then we'll talk a bit about the article, which I'll explain in more detail later, by Walt and Mearsheimer, two major professors at American universities, which basically condemns what they call the American Jewish lobby, or the neocons, for subordinating American interests to Israeli interests, which, of course, is not correct, and Oren supports that. And then we'll close with a little bit about President Carter's new book.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and roll that tape right now.
What is your perspective on what's happening in Lebanon now with Hezbollah's sudden demonstrations, show of strength, and overt statement that it wants to topple the Lebanese government?
Well, I think that though the Bush administration is making a spirited and I think well-intentioned effort to maintain the Lebanese government, ultimately the effort is going to prove fruitless. Keep in mind that Hezbollah is perhaps the most legitimate organization in Lebanon. I say this with great pain because it is a terrorist organization. Legitimate is why. Lebanon, the way it was constituted by the French back in the 1920s, divided its government positions according to membership in religious and ethnic communities. So you have a Maronite president, a Sunni prime minister, Druzi Speaker of the House, and then positions, the number of seats in its parliament are doled out according to the percentage which each ethnic and religious community has in the society.
In the population.
In the population.
Right.
But that formula is based on a census taken in 1932.
A little behind the times.
Little behind the times. Now, Lebanon's ethnic composition has changed dramatically since then. The Christians, which were once the majority, are now very much the minority. And the largest single ethnic group in Lebanon are the Shiites, who in the Lebanese democracy, quote unquote, have the least amount of power. So Lebanon is not a democracy as we understand it. It's a democracy in the sense that there are elections, but not elections in the sense that it's representative. It isn't representative. Therefore, the Shiites have a legitimate gripe. And Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, is basically riding the tiger of that gripe. And therefore, not only that, Hezbollah is also armed. And Hezbollah also has the backing of Iran and Syria, which today are the ascendant powers in the Middle East at a time when American power is waning. So it would seem that Hezbollah's march to power in Lebanon is inexorable.
So we're looking at the end of Lebanon as we know it.
We're looking at a different type of Lebanon.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that bad news.
It's very bad.
Yes. Okay. Different part of the world now. Let's come back to the United States. Recently, there was a rather popular canard regarding the road to Baghdad is through Jerusalem. If we solve the Israel-Arab conflict, everything else in the Middle East will suddenly fall into place. And this has been resurrected both by Tony Blair in England in some recent speeches, and by the soon-to-appear, but already actually leaked, a Baker report. What's your opinion on that whole concept?
Well, there's two problems with it. One, there is no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict in the foreseeable future for the simple reason that there's not a Palestinian leadership that's capable of taking a part in negotiations, signing on a dotted line, and carrying out the terms of any treaty. It just simply is not going to happen. At least not, I don't know, in my lifetime. But for the foreseeable future, it's